Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV and a Saturday show which we don't normally do, and this is sort of a standalone show, but it also fits in with two others, one we've done and one we have coming up, in that it's also about the operations that to cross the Rhine in the spring of 1945. So if you were with me earlier in the week, James Fenelon came on and talked about the gliders as part of Operation Varsity, and later in the week Ronald Yeltes, the Dutch historian, is coming on to talk about the British Rifle Brigade and their push and advance into Germany, which is also about the crossing of the Rhine. So this show about Task Force Baum, which many of you have heard of as the operation, we'll get into that of course in a minute, General Patton, prisoner of war camp behind the lines, is also about that period that was happening 77 years ago this week. So my guest today is a return visitor to World War II TV. Don M. Fox was on talking about the Armour Division during the Battle of the Bulge, and he's back to talk about the 4th this time in this particular operation. If you are new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to click like for the shows you're watching and leave a comment both during the show in the sidebar and also after the show. The links to everything you need are in the description below. You can find the links to Don's books. There's 2 books about the 4th Armored Division. The first book was more about last show. This one that we're talking about today covers the sort of 45, 46 period. The link is all there in the description below. Don is a author and historian, writes about various things, including World War II and restaurants and all sorts of things, and is currently in Florida and is beaming to us from there. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Don back in. So good afternoon, Don. How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Great to be with you.
Good. So you heard my little opening spiel there. So the crossing of the Rhine was all happening 77 years ago. And then suddenly, kind of out of the blue, really, this operation kind of begins. But it's actually part of an actual larger push forward by 4th Armored. And we were just talking before going live, folks. This is the time of the year that I find very fascinating in the war, because there's a lot of fatigue in the US and British and Canadian armies at this point. And yet, in terms of the armor divisions, they're kind of peaking in the sense that they've yet to peak because they're starting to get new technology coming through. The newer armored vehicles are coming through. So actually, they're doing really well, the 4th Armored Division. So before we get into the presentation, is this an era that you find fascinating to study because of that kind of fact that people don't really dive into this era particularly?
It really is. It receives far too little coverage and attention, little awareness. I think there's many people just think it was anticlimactic after the Bulge. It really was anything but, especially in various theaters, and especially for the units that were out at the tip of the spear. Germany was not ready to surrender, not anything close. In fact, the civilian population, in many cases, was participating in the defense of many of the towns as American forces came through. And it was the armored divisions and the recon and cavalry units that were in the thick of it. In fact, going back a little bit before the period in late March, I mean, when you go back to in the immediate aftermath of the Bulge, into late January, early February, when the forces are just breaking through across the Siegfried Line, into Germany towards Bitburg, where the 4th Armor was involved. Yeah, pretty heavy fighting, and it all sounds great it all sounds easy on paper when we're just adding up the numbers. For the men who had to do the fighting, it was anything but.
Well, absolutely. And this idea we talked about with James is that it's the wounded animal. The German army is on the brink of defeat. The Soviets are, advancing way in towards Berlin from the other side. The West, they're squeezing everywhere. They're being pushed out of Italy. The writing is on the wall. And yet, at the same time, we're talking about the morale of the British and Americans. The German morale, Goebbels' propaganda machine is still doing well in convincing the Germans that the desperation of holding on, they don't want to be taken by the Soviets to the east. There's all these old men and the young kids. We know the cliches, but they're true, coming out defending street by street, house by house. And the crossing of the Rhine was a big psychological barrier as well as a physical barrier. So there's still a lot of fight left in the German army, despite their tricky position strategically, and that's the situation we're in. So let's give us before we bring in the Baum himself, let's have a look at the situation report and kind of remind ourselves where things were, as we said, 77 years ago, pretty much today. We're talking about the March 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th period. We know that Operation Varsity has occurred, that the airborne jumps are across the Rhine. Things have been happening at Remagen, but what's happening in the sector we're talking about today, Don?
Yeah, so let's start with actually a good starting point for this period in this area of the campaign is Remagen, good to mention, because March 7th is when it's taken by the 9th Armored Division, seizing the bridge. And then on the 8th, the 4th Armored arrives at the Rhine in the area of Ermitz. And there's a bridge there intact. And it's almost nighttime, past sunset, twilight on the 8th. And it was at the time Al Erzik was commander of the 8th Tank Battalion. And his armor arrived at the heights overlooking the bridge. And when they started to advance, took some very heavy 88 millimeter fire. They actually pulled back, called in artillery to pummel the area. And the one thing that was notable was there was just a mass of German forces and civilians fleeing across that bridge. They could observe it all types of motor vehicles, armor, horse-drawn carts, jammed bumper to bumper. So they called in artillery to start to hit that. And then in the morning of the 9th, they were going to attack again to seize the bridge. And as they were advancing down the slope towards the bridge, the Germans blew it with everybody on it. Mass casualty. It was just, as Urza described it, just horrific to see the vehicles, people, horses catapulted in the air. Bridge collapsed into the river, and they were that close to having a second bridge. But at that point, all the focus, of course, was on Remagen for the Third Army. They didn't have a crossing site immediately, and there was a change in the plan, much to Patton's disappointment. He would have loved to have tried to vault over the Rhine in some form or fashion. You know how competitive it was between he and Montgomery, and trying to get across. But somewhat to his disappointment, at first, he was ordered to turn the Third Army south, away from the Rhine, and across the Moselle. And the Moselle flows into the Rhine. Moselle, it's interesting. This was the second time in the Fourth Armored's history that the Moselle came into play. They had crossed it back in September before the Ericourt tank battles in the vicinity of Nancy. Here they were, much farther east, much closer to the source of the Moselle. So it was actually when they turned south, the bridges across the Moselle were blown. They couldn't get across, and the 5th Infantry Division, actually the 5th and the 90th. I mentioned the 5th first, or paused on them, because the 5th may have been the best river crossers, assault division going across rivers. I think they may have carried out more assaults across rivers than any other division during the campaign. But they eventually carried the weight of the attack across the Moselle. And then the 4th followed across on the 15th. The 14th, the infantry divisions forged the bridgeheads, and then the 4th Army came across on the 15th and moved out in front of the infantry divisions. Then it's the spearheads advancing from the Moselle to the Rhine. And at that point, because the Rhine actually jogs to the east, and there's quite a bit of ground to cover between the Moselle, and then when you eventually get back to the Rhine, if you're heading due east. In fact, if you pull up that map that you had, if you've got that handy, and people can perhaps see that. So actually, where units are coming in here, the 4th was coming in towards Bad Kreuznach and Alzey. They were not shown on the map, but the axis of advance was going down through those two towns. And 4th capture both of those. So almost on the border of the you see the 80 between the 6th and the 12th Army Group. So the 4th Armored Division was all the way down at the boundary of the 12th Army Group, which was 3rd Army on the side. And you can see on the line there then the line between the 3rd and the 7th Armies. So The fourth, then actually advancing on the south part of that loop, then turned north, swept up the west bank of the Rhine towards Nierstein, which is on the map, and Oppenheim. So they cleared it out first, and then the 5th Infantry Division came up from behind to then begin the assault crossing of the Rhine on March 22nd. After they completed the crossing, there was a bridging put in, and then the 4th Armored began its crossing on the morning of the 24th. Combat Command A, led by Sears at that point, carried that cross, went across first, and then Abrams, Creighton Abrams, famously, who had commanded the 37th Tank Battalion through most of the war, was now in command of Combat Command B. He had taken over just a few weeks before. So Combat Command B, followed behind CCA and then split off to the right. So CCA peeled up to the north, more in the direction of Frankfurt, and then CCB continuing almost due east towards Aschaffenburg. And actually, looking at it, you can see that on the map with the 4th Armored indicated. So a pretty good separation between them at that point, and really headed in divergent directions. This particular map really doesn't articulate it, the disparity in direction as well as it actually was. You can see on the map, CCB kind of goes to the northeast. Well, it was really more due east. Because where they ended up getting a crossing was south of Aschaffenburg at a railroad bridge at Niflheim. Now, they tried for another crossing a little farther north, and that was blown in front of them. So this is the bridge that on the Main River that Abrams Combat Command captured. They took it intact and got their armor across. Not much of a road. Even today, when I visited there in 2019 and captured that picture, it's a bunch of farmland on the opposite side. There's the rail line that goes across. Not really super maneuverable, and you can imagine probably at that time, late March, ground conditions were still a bit moist. Not the friendliest. So not the easiest thing to navigate once they got across. But having made the crossing. And really in the that same day, in fact, that map is from 12th Army Group at the time, their position map, and that shows that difference in direction a little bit better. You can see it off Schaffenburg. That tip is where Combat Command B, Abrams, got across. And it was about that time that Patton interceded and hatched the idea for the raid. Now, I should back up by saying that the main mission of the division of the 4th Armored at that point was to continue north at that crossing just east of Frankfurt. You see where near Hanau was located. I talk about a heavy fight, by the way. I could talk for a half hour about the battle that took place there on that crossing and that bridge. Incredible courage, heavy counterattack. The Americans, the 51st Armored Infantry Battalion, crossed that bridge, part of the 4th. A trainload of German troops and engineers rolled in. It was 24 hours of hell that they had, and had the good fortune to interview one of the participants there and talk about that in the book. But in any event,
we can do that next year or the year after, yeah. Don. We can
yeah.
deep dive on that one.
Sure.
You can come back whenever you want.
Sure, but that was going to be the main thrust. So Patton intercedes. There's a number of conversations between the Corps commander Mantonetti, Hogue, who is now the commander of the division. Hogue he had led the combat command that captured the bridge at Remagen, and then was rewarded, if you will, promoted to command of the 4th. Hugh Gaffey who had been Patton's chief of staff before the Bulge, had taken command of the 4th back in December, and then now moved on. Hogue comes in, and virtually almost the first thing Hogue is asked to do is be part of this mission to form a task force to go to Oflag XIII-B, which is in the town of Hammelburg. And as the crow flies, about 35 miles northeast or so of where Abrams has crossed the Rhine River. And there's and this is on the map that you've got up. This is the actual route of the task force that they ended up following. So you can see just south of Aschaffenburg, there's a town that's not noted on the map, but just south of there, Schweinheim, and that was and the Americans were holding positions just west outside the town, and almost due south of Aschaffenburg on the map. And so Patton's desire was for a task force to be formed to go all the way to Hammelburg to liberate prisoners that were in the camp. And he knew, well, to his knowledge, there were 900 officers in the Oflag. Now, there's also a Stalag, enlisted men, that right next to it, with like 10,000 prisoners. But all the discussion was always about the Oflag. I find that interesting. The officers' prisoner war camp. Not much mention ever about the enlisted camp next to it. But in any event, Patton knows from intelligence that there's 900. He even wrote about that at the time. There are 900 prisoners. But in the briefing that gets done, eventually down to Baum, who ends up commanding the raid, it's 300 is what they're told. And that's what they plan the task force around. Enough extra vehicles, enough half tracks to transport back about 300 people. And that was even going to be tight to get to 300 with what they actually sent out there. In fact, there were questions from the outset about having enough fuel and enough room to get enough fuel to get back and enough vehicles to get everybody back. And the instruction basically was, well, commandeer vehicles and steal gas. Not exactly the best way to plan a mission. So something of great debate for a long time is about the size of the task force, and I should talk about that a little bit. Endless back and forth about who wanted a small task force of about just a little over 300 men. Basically, the foundation, the basis of the task force, primarily built around a company of tanks, medium tanks, and a company of armored infantry, both under strength. Only about 170 some odd men, as I recall, in the armored infantry company, and only 10 medium tanks out of the normal complement of 17. Also, by the way, a common misperception of a lot of people is that it somehow at this point in the war, everybody's fighting at full strength and American forces are no, far from it. Whether through battle or mechanical attrition, here you've got this particular armored tank company that's selected well under strength going out on this mission.
Just to interject, this is the time when there is plenty of stuff available. It's just taking ages to get to the front because the lines are massively long now because stuff is still coming ashore way back in the line there. So there are huge stockpiles of tanks coming off the production line. There are stockpiles of tanks and vehicles getting onto ships, getting off ships. But at the sharp end, especially after the winter, because the Battle of the Bulge has drained a lot of the reserve of supplies the Allies had built up, ready for the push on. The bad weather hasn't helped. Bad weather in Italy hasn't helped. So at this point now, it's all available. It's just not available where it's needed.
Yes, yeah, spot on. So going back to let's take a step back. So the raid is commissioned originally. Harold Cohen, who was the commander of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, was enlisted to lead it. But he was famous. It might be the second most famous case of hemorrhoids in military history. So bad that Patton asked him to drop his pants so he could take a look himself. And he said, I think those are something to the effect that those are the worst hemorrhoids he'd ever seen. And Cohen couldn't go. And that is how Baum, who was the S3, was selected. And he was a seasoned veteran of the battalion and served throughout the campaign and with the division from the outset. Tremendously experienced, talented, brave officer. So he was put in command of the task force. As I mentioned, had the company of armored infantry, the company of medium tanks, a platoon of light tanks that came from D Company of the 37th, elements of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion's reconnaissance platoon. They had to. There were actually a small number of men from some of the other armored infantry companies who had to drive the half tracks, the extra half tracks. And by the way, and I would point out, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Peter Dohm's work on the task force, Task Force Baum .de, German. I think he's now retired military. Really, the preeminent expert. I hope he's listening in. He was kind enough when I visited on my research trip to travel the route to meet with me and gave me a lot of schooling on a lot of elements of this. So, listeners, put that one in your browser later.
Yeah, and again, Tom, I'm just going to jump in again now because before we went live, folks, we were saying that this whole operation, task force, rescue mission, whatever you want to call it, and I always do my bad research before doing this show, and I've seen it referred to as secret mission and audacious this and dash and rescue mission, this, that, and folly, Patton's folly, whatever I've heard it as. It's generally told from the point of view of Patton. It's generally used by the biographers of Patton who don't like Patton as a stick with which to beat Patton. And frankly, it's an easy argument to make that it was from that point of view. But the reason we brought you on, the reason we want to talk about today is from the point of view of these people who were given this task. Because as you've explained, it wasn't what they were supposed to be doing. They weren't expecting it. They are under strength, and suddenly they've been given this task to accomplish. And in the military, whether you agree with a plan or don't agree with your plan, it is your duty to fulfill it and carry it out to the best of your abilities. And it's that point of view we want, because, again, it's already come up in the sidebar about how far this task force had to go. And when we're talking about the distance some of these armor divisions have traveled across Europe of hundreds of miles, we're not talking very far. But as you said, you have driven this route yourself, or route, you would say, route, I would say. And, I want you to really get across to the viewers that it's difficult country with difficult terrain and difficult situation to deal with on the way there. And that's the point of view we're wanting to hear about. The vehicle. So that's what I'm just telling you. We're not going to spend ages talking about Patton. Well, we will a bit.
So on exactly 77 years ago today, on the 26th, the bomb is assembled. He has to assemble the task force, and they're outside the town of Schweinheim. And first they've got to be sprung loose, because the city of Aschaffenburg had a very strong defense component to it. And this was Schweinheim's a suburb south of it. So they didn't know what to expect. There wasn't the time to really conduct reconnaissance. As it was, Abrams already knew he was going to have to pull out and turn it over to the 7th Army, to the operating to the south of him. Another notable thing about the raid, once they left and got on this route, they were on their own. The 4th Armored was going to head north in a complete 90-degree different direction. So they were on their own in every sense. So first things first, they've got to break them through the German line in the town of Schweinheim. So there were another task force, if you will, a medium tank company, armored infantry company, had the job of opening up that town. And they fell behind schedule doing it. Heavy fighting in the town. It was much heavier defended than they thought. Panzerfaust infantry. They knocked out a couple of American tanks with the other tank company during that battle. And the entire operation was getting behind schedule right from the get-go. Now, it's middle of the night and Baum finally just says, "Hey, we're going through," and he tells his counterparts. It was I think Lieutenant Pancake, if I'm not mistaken, in command of the tank company, the B company that was actually fighting to open up the town. He said, "Look, I'm just put your tanks on the sidewalks." And then he ended up telling the Lieutenant Tessier, who commanded the armored infantry company, "Move your men aside. We're going through." And he put the medium tanks out front, followed by the light tanks, and then some of the half tracks, and followed with peeps, jeeps. Some would say. I tried to stay true to the historical reference. It's peeps, not jeeps. And it said, "Hey, we're going to go through. We're going to turn on lights out. We're turning on the sirens, full blast, and we are just going to go through." And he instructed his men, if any vehicle gets disabled, ram it, push it aside. We aren't stopping. And so they do just that. And so you can imagine, still even just 2 companies, it is a fairly long convoy going through. I mean, just and not with a liberal amount of spacing. He actually he bunched them up a little closer than you might typically for prudence sake, but he kept them closer bunched, and they started through the town. The Germans were caught off guard, I think, at first by the accounts, and didn't return fire immediately. Started to once it was moving through, but miraculously, somewhat, they were actually moved through Schweinheim without taking any casualties or having any vehicle loss. And you can see on the map, and it's great to leave the map up here. This will help guide it. So the roads they go through, Hallbach, Besserbach, and then it skews north towards Hostbach. These are they're secondary, tertiary roads still today. They are not elaborate part of a road network. When they get into any of those towns, very tightly constricted. And it was in Besserbach in particular, you see it takes a hard jog to the left. Baum at that point, because they don't have the benefit of a lot of maps, and of course, traveling at night, it's dark. Even though, interestingly, there was a full moon, it was right around that time, but there was heavy overcast, so that it really diminished some of the natural moonlight. And but he had to get out of the vehicle, out of his peep there, and just make sure everybody was making the proper left-hand turn, navigating it, that nobody was going to go in the right direction. I mean, it is not an easy affair to take these dozens of vehicles and keep them all on the right route. And so they did get up to, it's actually not marked here on the map, but Highway 26. So a lot of that route from west to east is on 26, and a little bit better road net. They started to hit their first contact around Laubach. So not really far into it. Still in the middle of it's still during the night. Sunrise hasn't come up yet, and they see some troops that are on a training ground. They get in an exchange. They really never stop moving throughout. So it's basically just shooting as they go by. And it's something important for people to keep in mind too. Even a task force like this isn't barreling along at even anywhere close to full speed of the vehicles. I often, for enthusiasts out there, the M4A3E2 Sherman tank, popularly known as the Jumbo, gets talked a lot about it's so heavy and it's slower. The task force never running at that speed. So there was famously the tank Cobra King, which was the tank that broke through to was at the point, breaking through at Bastogne, was in this task force. And the task force is maybe moving 10, 12, 15 miles an hour would be fast at that point moving. So a Jumbo has no problem really keeping up with the task force. I just thought I'd mention it. The armor enthusiasts will understand that out there. So they're as they move through Laubach after hitting some light contact. You see how on the map it zigzags a bit, and you're then moving into forested area, very steep grades, switchbacks. It's again just not the easiest thing to navigate, and through all that forested area, were they to have come across any substantive resistance, they could have been stopped in their tracks. Just one disabled tank blocking the road would create a problem. But just a couple of minor points of contact along the way as they weave their way through, and it's when they get to Lohr, a fairly large town / small city, probably large town to be a better description. Yeah, it straddles the main river there, and because the Main, interestingly enough, even though they crossed the Main way back there, it is a very circuitous route to that river. So it jogs back to the north. You see it pretty clearly on the map here with the dark lines. It makes a large appendage going up, and it terminates, but it flows up to Gmunden, which figures very prominently in a little bit to the north. That's the northern extent of the Main River there. So at Lohr, the plan is to stay on the west side of the river, and you can see the red line which marks the route stays to the west. There are bridges in Lohr that were intact, and they could have gone across, but the plan is stay on the west side of it. There's a rail line that traces the river as well. So as they're approaching Lohr, it's again it's mountainous, extremely hilly territory, but they make it into the town, or to the edge of the town, relatively undisturbed, and there they do encounter some forces. They actually came up on what turned out to be some female. I just how best to describe military members, but in uniform, so maybe in a service capacity. And in the book Raid, it's written about quite a bit with and Raid being people may be familiar with it. It was Abe Baum was a co-author of that, along with Richard Goldhurst, who wrote about it from the point of view of the prisoners in the camp. But here at least one woman was killed as they fired on that force, and they managed to navigate through that outer part of Lohr without taking any losses. German forces were in the town, so they got a bit fortunate there. And by this point, it's sunrise. It's daylight by this point in time. And then, as they're making their way up along the side of the river, along comes an ACAC train, which is basically a train with cement pillboxes on it and anti-aircraft guns mounted. But the grade, the level of the rail line is above the level of the road. So they're actually, as the train's higher than them as they're traveling down. So train's coming one direction, they're going the other, and they start shooting up the train. And because of course, throughout this, while it is a stealth mission, they weren't shy about shooting up any lucrative targets that they could along the way, and certainly they couldn't risk being fired upon. But to their advantage was the fact that the gunners, the German gunners in the train, could not depress their guns low enough because the road was below the grade. So they were able to tear that train up pretty well. The armored infantry, as they passed, again, remember they're not flying by at 30 plus miles an hour. It's going at a moderate pace. So the armored infantry that were following up actually used thermite grenades and were able to disable the guns and took care of it. So there's that encounter, and then as they're moving towards Gmunden, they see some tugs, some barges out in the river. They shoot those up, and then they get to Gmunden, which is where they plan on crossing a tributary of the Main, which they've got to get across that tributary, and if they do, they will then make their way to Highway 27, which is a good quality road that is going to lead to the general direction of Hammelburg. And by the way, just a side note, again, to show how hastily this was done, they didn't even know where the prisoner of war camp was. All they knew it was near Hammelburg. They didn't have it.
I was just going to ask, because we've had a question from Sheldrake was asking what maps they were using at this point, and to add to that, I want to say, what intel did they have? I mean, because at this point in the war, the Allies should have reams of aerial photos, lots of intelligence, lots of really good maps, because this is what we've been building to for years. But in this particular case, you said they didn't even know where the camp is. I'm assuming they're going out there not really knowing what the road, strength is going to be, what right. the intel is.
Very weak intel. Remember, this whole thing was hatched in like less than 24 hours. I mean, the bomb had basically a couple of hours to get ready to go. So rudimentary maps. And the map question is a good one, because here's where it came into play. Their maps are directing them to this point. They know they're going to cross. They know where they want to go up to catch Highway 27. But here, as they get to Gmunden, and this tributary splits Gmunden almost in two. So this is looking east. So this is the view that Baum's task force would have had as it's approaching the bridge. But you've got a lot of buildings behind you, out of view, pretty densely packed. It's not as wide open as this photo is. Like the buildings are right around you at your back. So they get to the bridge. There's mines on the approach, and members of the reconnaissance platoon go out, clear off the mines. They're drawing fire from the opposite side. They're exchanging. There are, and to this day, they are the same buildings. There were flanking. You can see them actually across the bridge on each side of the road. There's a 3-story building. So those are prominent features. You see the castle up on the bluff, but presumably from those 3-story buildings in particular, flanking it on the other side of the river, that's where a lot of fire was coming from. So no casualties immediately, but they're exchanging it to get the mines off, and then they're planning the assault on the bridge. But there's a lot of exchange of fire going on. And then they come under either Panzerfaust or certainly Panzerfaust, maybe anti-tank fire as well. One of the officers thought it was AT guns, but definitely Panzerfaust. And in all likelihood, there were Germans on their side of the river based on what happened and some of the damage that they took. So in fact, the tank company commander, Lieutenant Nutto, he was sort of in a little, he was conferring with Baum at the time, and then the battle came to them on the west side. He was actually in the same Panzerfaust strike that kind of hit the pavement, wounded both Baum and Nutto. Nutto more seriously. In fact, he was out of the fight, at least for the moment. After that, Baum kept going, even though he was hit a really bad knee injury, as I recall, and some other things. But I think the knee was the worst part at that point. And they had their hands full. So with the tanks disabled, they had to leave it to the infantry to get across. So one of the platoon commanders started to take men across. Several were on the other side. And then as 2 other men were coming across, the Germans blew the bridge. So it had been all mined and ready to go. They blew it. Two men that lost their lives on the bridge. I've never been entirely sure of the fate of the men on the other side. They never joined the task force again. They were stranded on the other side. I'm going to presume taken prisoner. But in my research, I was never able to trace those particular individuals and what may have happened or gotten an account of that. But there were some men that were had made it across and then stranded there. So at that point, the bridge is blown. Baum has so he's got to figure out what the heck he's going to do. So in fact, if you go back to the map, so the original route was going to go almost due east from Gmunden, sort of east northeast, so you would pick up 20, almost a straight line to the northeast towards Hammelburg. But instead, you can see this circuitous route that has to go on starting north. And it's the, I think it's the Seine River that goes up that way. And so that red line traces the west side of that river. But the map, he shows no bridges on his map. So he starts north, wishful thinking. There's got to be something somewhere eventually. We'll just look for it. And here they go, and they start up, and along the route, they end up actually taking run into more Germans, take a prisoner and a German officer as well. That is a guide. They use him to help get some directions. They're really relying on that a lot in terms of what would be the best route to try to get to the vicinity of Hammelburg. They find a crossing, a bridge that was probably lucky. They were lucky to carry the weight. It was a wooden structure, as I recall, in Bergson, and there the river itself is fairly narrow. It's not but wide enough to stop vehicles from crossing. But they do find a bridge there and then make the crossing. As they're continuing to the southeast, there still is going to be another river that they've got to cross near Grafendorf. And in the route, along the route, the German soldier that they had with them said, "I don't know the area. I can't help you anymore." And in fact, at one point, took him on a, I don't know, who knows whether he's being serious or not, basically put him on a road that took him to a dead end up on a hill for mining, where there's a mining camp. They had to back the whole thing up and come back. They realized, either intentionally or not, this soldier, this prisoner, was not going to be of any help to us. And they actually ended up discarding him, and he picked up a civilian whose name now eludes me at the moment, but an elderly civilian that then went with them, but he was somewhat limited to in what he could do. And in this area too, along this part of the route, famously written about in some of the other books, and I think it may have been closer to on Grafendorf, they came across some Russian prisoners being held by the Germans, which they released, couple hundred of them, and that made for some, I'm sure, some fun times for the Germans that have been holding them prisoner. A little bit of retribution on their minds, I would think. But that was a bit of a sideshow. The task force gets back on its way, and then on the map, you can see that southwest of Hammelburg, it takes a sharp jog to the left. And that's where it gets back to Highway 27. And when you're there, that part of the route, so you've really emerged from an area that's, again, more wooded, restricted views, small towns, and all of a sudden you get to this T in the road that is this expansive, gorgeous view. And sort of off to your right, you see Hill 427. It's the most prominent feature in the area. It's on the tail end of a string of hills, or hills is the proper way to describe it, I guess, but part of a sort of a mountain range that extends southwest to northeast. And unknown to Baum, it's also a German observation point, and there's an observation tower. Remnants of it, I think, are still there. It's on the military base. I was not able to visit it myself, but I can see it still on Google Earth images. You can see it there on the crest of at the peak of the hill. And so he was no doubt being fully observed, especially from this point forward. There had been, along the way too, German observation aircraft at sea, which they actually had fired upon. And so Baum had an excellent sense that it was no surprise at this point that they were there, and especially after the observation aircraft came in, which, by the way, I should point out, there was very limited contact that he had, fleeting radio contact with his forces. Didn't have air support. I mean, this goes back to how hastily this was done. At this stage, if it had any planning at all, I mean, he would have had air support, artillery support. The fact that other than 305 millimeter assault guns that were assigned to it, Sherman tanks armed with the 105s, that was all he had for, high explosives, obviously on the regular Shermans too. But that was his dedicated indirect fire support, if he needed it, was coming from those assault guns. And here you see the photo of what Hammelburg looks like from the heights, from the high ground where Baum would have seen it. So there's a stream that runs from left to right here, way closer to the town. On the route that Baum took in, actually right before you got to this point, as he was approaching closer to Hammelburg, the Germans finally had put together a strong opposing force. And it was built around an anti-tank battalion. Not nearly at full strength. It's designated as a heavy tank battalion. It was Hetzer tank destroyers, Czechoslovakian made, not uncommon weapons in the German arsenal. There's a great picture of them. My friend Erwin Verholen from Belgium had sent me that. So
I walk past one every time I go to my van to go shopping, incidentally. There's one just around the corner from me. And I just want to interject as well, because you said it yourself, but I wanted to kind of confirm it there. Everything that should be in the Allies' arsenal to give them superiority is lacking on this mission. The Allies should have superior intel. They should have air support, strength in depth behind them, large thrust of people around them. As you said, the rest of the Fourth Armored are going in a different direction. There should be ground intelligence. There should be, all these things that we should be taking for granted at this point in the war are being ignored in this. This is more of a kind of a 1941 British kind of when there's no hope left kind of commando mission, desperate times. This is 1945. We shouldn't be doing this.
I just I scratch my head every time I think about the composition of the task force. I mean, even down to the things that they, even without massively increasing the size, and because famously there was debates about should a combat command have gone, and which the answer to that is yes. Abrams wanted a combat command. He protested vociferously to Patton directly about only sending these two companies, this 300-man task force. A combat command, he said, and he was right, could have gone anywhere. They had been doing that for ever since all the approach to the Rhine. Said everything after Bitburg, a combat command could go. Not they would be opposed. Fighting might be heavy, but the Germans weren't going to stop a combat command. They were going to stop this task force, and they could have assigned Hellcat tank destroyers from the 704th. It's a platoon, 4 of them would have helped. M7s, they could have sent a battery of 105 millimeter howitzers for support. For reconnaissance, they could have sent some M8 armored cars along for better recon.
So why didn't they? I mean, or will we do that at the end? I mean, why wasn't a larger force sent? Was there a sense, you think, that Patton is embarrassed about doing this at the beginning, so sends a smaller force because he wants it to kind of go under the radar, or is it just an error?
I think the main thing is he wanted it under the radar.
Right.
He wanted it under the radar, and he thought that at this stage of the war, interestingly enough, subject to some of the misconceptions that we talk about that people have now, like, the Germans are too weak. This is this will be okay. Keep it under the radar. And by the way, tons of revisionist history. And I won't stay on Patton too long, but later on he would talk about how he wanted to send a combat command, and it was other people that talked him out of it. I think when you piece it all together, and I did a ton of research on this from various people that were involved in principles. I'll just say what my own conclusion was. He wanted it small. He was the one who wanted it limited to basically the two companies. Other people protested, wanted it to be larger. He held his ground and wanted it to be small. Okay. That's fine. That's at least where I landed on it. So, so at this point, when as they're approaching Hammelburg from the west, the Hetzers put them under fire. And so now you're in a Sherman tank, basically, versus Hetzer duel. The Hetzer's firing from the opposite side. And this is the view from where the Hetzers are. So this is from the opposite direction. So Hammelburg is actually sort of behind them to the left. The Americans were approaching from the right side of this photo. You see the one prominent building, but that flanks a road that they were then approaching down, moving in this photo from the viewer's right to left. And then you can see almost dead center a road that carves up. You can see a trace of it there, and that is the road that then leads up to where the camp is. And the camp is up on the heights above that. And so as the task force is making its way along that road, going that right to left, the Hetzers are putting under fire. They're engaging. Baum puts his assault guns on there is a tourist overlook. Back then, it's there today. Back then, but it was just that back then. For vehicle stop, he would pull on the side of the road, look at the scenic view of Hammelburg, such as what I shared was in the other picture. He puts two of the 105 millimeter assault guns there to provide covering fire. They actually managed to hit some soft targets that are carrying fuel and ammo for the Hetzers. And some of this was picked up too. There's pretty good German after action reports on this action too, which I found fascinating as part of the research to read the German point of view on it. And so they inflict some damage there, but the damage is happening both ways. Americans are taking losses, losing vehicles, half tracks. The commander of the armored infantry company is then mortally wounded. So that's a big loss. Major Stiller, who accompanied, right? I didn't talk a lot about Stiller, but Stiller outranked Baum. And who is Major Stiller? Well, Major Stiller was Patton's aide, personal aide, knew him going back from his time in World War I. An ex-Texas Ranger, as I recall. All right, so Stiller's assigned to go on this mission, even though he outranks Baum. What Baum is told is that he's just along for the experience. During the campaign, he hasn't been in combat. No, the reason he's on it is because he can identify Patton's son-in-law, John Waters, who's in the prisoner of war camp, which is, of course, all the controversy surrounding the raid, the real motivations. That's why Stiller is there, is so that when they get to the camp, he can identify Waters, be his bodyguard, if you will, his aide, and make sure he gets him out. So along it's interesting, during the battle, as they're going up that road and making their way to the camp, best I've been able to determine, actually, the peep that Stiller was in actually gets hit by enemy fire. He wasn't injured. There's an interesting award citation given to some other people that helped him, and it's very cryptically written about the officer that was on a special mission. And it's almost certainly is Stiller that they're talking about, but even then, they're sort of protecting the identity of Stiller at that point in this other officer's citation.
I'm just doing some sort of lateral thinking. Is there also a possibility that Stiller was there also when he gets there, not just to identify Waters, but also to kind of brief him on what not to say, to make sure he says the right things should there be any kind of PR thing? Because you could, frankly, just show anybody a photo of the guy and everybody would know. It seems there's more than just the identification.
Yeah. Well, I think clearly that Patton couldn't have entrusted it to anybody else.
Yeah.
Or even made it known that his son-in-law was there. He had it on pretty good information that he was there. Didn't know how to give Patton the benefit of the doubt for a moment. He didn't know with certainty that he was here. Because you're talking about Red Cross information, and Waters came to the camp he'd been held in a prisoner of war camp all the way out in Poland, and had a heck of a time. Colonel Good actually was his commanding officer, or superior officer in the camp. Waters had been captured in North Africa. He'd been held prisoner for almost 3 years at that point, and he was in another Oflag out in Poland. As the Russians approached, standard operating procedure for the Germans was no prisoners were able to be rescued or repatriated, if you will. They would, if the enemy was approaching, same thing applied for American forces. Western allies. The orders were, do not let them be repatriated. You would march them to another camp. So Waters and Good and the other all the other prisoners that were in their camp, they went through an arduous trek from Poland to get over to eventually end up at Oflag XIII-B in Hammelburg. So anyway, so that is fair to, I think most observers would agree. Stiller is there for that purpose, to look after Waters. Nobody else knows that he's there, but they're obviously confident enough to send this mission out after him. So when Baum, after the fight with the Hetzers, going back to what happens to the camp, they get to the outer approach to the camp, which you had the one picture, and that's the closest I was able to get because it's still an active military base today. And the story about that camp is it was a military training ground, still is today. And it was converted into a prisoner of war camp during the campaign. But the Germans had a huge advantage on this site because it was a vast, sprawling training ground. And the forces that were there, there were forces in addition to just the camp security guards, engineers, other forces that thoroughly knew this entire area. It was as a training ground. So this is the approach area that they then assaulted over to go towards the camp, and wide open ground that they had to move in over. And remember, it's daytime, so this is still during the day on the 27th when they're making the assault. In addition to the American officers, which, by the way, Baum thought there were 300. The best intel, and Patton wrote about this. Patton thought there were 900, but Baum was only told 300. That still is a bit of a head scratcher to this day, but it's well documented. Patton himself wrote at the time wrote about there being 900 people. So, but Baum's misinformed. But it turned out there were 1,300 American officers and 3,000 Serbian officers, because Serbians were being kept in the same camp. Well, now as the battle is raging, and the Germans are actually defending the camp. So there's a firefight with American forces as the medium tanks are approaching over this open ground with the infantry. Baum spreads them out in a bit of a desert formation, spread across. Pretty heavy fighting, nighttime's approaching, but they make their way to the camp. And as this is going on, the fighting's pretty intense. And in fact, there's during the battle, the Americans, the task force members, end up firing into the camp on people that they think are Germans that are actually the Serbians, because they're not familiar uniforms or they're the garb that they have on. So it's a mess. It's a shit show, if you will. And then the commander of the German, the prisoner element, or the guard element, of the actual commander of the camp, decides to surrender the camp to the senior officer among the POWs.
Right. Waters
is second in command, but he may be surrendering the camp to him, but the prisoner, the commanding officer over the prison guards, if you will, is not in command of the forces that are actually fighting vociferously against the task force. So Waters volunteers to go out with a small contingent under a white flag to try to negotiate a ceasefire or the surrender of the force. And as he's going through the gates, making his way out under the white flag, a German soldier shoots him down in the sort of towards the buttocks. Puts him down, basically can't move, paralyzed, if you will, very close to the base of his spine. It is a serious wound. And at that point, they there's a German with there's a German one of the I think it was an officer. I don't want to misspeak, but I think it was an officer that was from the prison guard detachment, if you will, that then convinces the German who shot him to not shoot anybody else. And okay. Now we're going to go back to the camp. So they go back to the armed German, escorts them back. They takes them back up into the camp. Waters is put into a blanket to use as a makeshift litter to carry them back. So here you have the very subject of the raid, the object of the raid, if you will, now fighting for his life. He gets taken back into the camp, and there's a Serbian doctor, a surgeon, who then tries to treat him and operate on him. Well, we saw him in the picture with Patton. He obviously survives it, but seriously wounded. So the fight continues until now the task force makes its way to the gates, breaks in. The Germans that are there, have retreated. Those that were defending do not surrender. They just retreat. They're going to come back. Many of those are going to come back on the scene shortly. So this photo, by the way, is from the when the 14th Armored Division liberated the camp several days later.
Yeah, it's the best we have.
But gives you an excellent picture of the scene and the nature of the buildings and so on. So here they break into the camp. Nightfall. It's really about nighttime is approaching. All of a sudden, Baum sees that there are hundreds, thousands of prisoners here. And he's like, "This I did not plan for. Where am I prepared for?" He's lost half-tracks vehicles. He's taken serious losses up to this point. So he sends a radio message out. Doesn't know if it's received or not. It was not acknowledged, saying that, okay, sort of mission accomplished. I'm here at the camp. But now he's got a whole another arduous task in front of him. How on earth do we get back? And how do I get back with anything close to all these prisoners? Because he knows nothing about waters. Right. In fact, Stiller, the whole time up to this point, it wasn't until they're getting to the camp where Stiller comes up to him and says, Can I have a squad of infantrymen? And he doesn't tell him why, but he gives them to him. And Stiller takes the squad to go into the camp and finds Waters, and then does track him down in there. So Baum now is trying to figure out what the heck to do, and he's dealing with the officer in charge of the senior officer in charge of the prisoners, who is not in good shape in terms of, I would say, psychologically to deal with this. They don't have enough vehicles. What they ended up doing is Baum. Well, actually, he asked the officer at first he delegated to him the task of deciding who would get on the vehicles, who'd be able to go, what sense of priority. The officer couldn't handle it. So Baum just had to say to everybody, look, anybody who can get a spot. If not, you got to walk. You can keep up with this, great, but we'll get on everybody we can. So the prisoners that could find space did. Just every inch of the tank, every person they could squeeze into a half track. Normally, the M3 half track would carry 10 men. Maybe you could squeeze in another half dozen normally. Well, they probably exceeded that, and they were sitting on the hoods and the bumpers and every spot on the tank, on every tank they could. The tank commanders are shooing people away if they can't traverse the guns or block the turrets, but every square inch that could be occupied is occupied. Now it's nighttime, and they're thinking about how they are going to try to leave at night. And you can see on the map all the zigzagging line south of Hammelburg. That is the convoluted route that the task force tried to take to get out. And when they finally saddled up, and it was middle of the night, and they were going to start with the tanks leading, and they were barely outside the immediate area of the camp before they came under fire. and one tank got knocked out. In fact, I'm not sure. It may have been when Cobra King got knocked out, because Cobra King got knocked out right in the vicinity of the camp. And so they had to reorganize after that. And then they sent, so he, rather than sending the entire task force out, he sent an advance group. And Lieutenant Nutto, who commanded the tank company, had recovered enough from his wounds back at Gemünden that he was back in the fight, and then led this group. And they were down to I think only 6 Shermans at that point, so they lost 4 out of the 10. They kept the assault guns behind. They still had 2 of the 3 assault guns, and they sent out the Shermans, some prisoners still riding on them, and headed out to the southwest. Now, all of this area, everything you see on that map is on the training ground of the camp. So it shows something about the expansiveness of the training area. So as they start to this, heading almost due south, and then you can see how it kind of goes south, then turns north. It's because there's you see it on a map today. I think it's called Bonland. It was actually a training town, a fake town, if you will, that it was an infantry training school, and they would do fighting training, urban warfare training in this town. Well, the Germans set up some roadblocks there. The task force couldn't go. They decided not to go through there to try to push through the roadblock, timbers and blocking the road. They got Nutto got a bad sense. He thought that they were going to come under fire, that it would be defended, and so he turned to the north. He goes to the north. And that whole area, you move towards that range of mountains, of which Hill 427 is on the lower end. In fact, on the map here, you can see where it's got the little dotted line, the dotted arrows, the black arrows next to the red. That is right around the area of Hill 427. So they start. So Nutto takes that group south. And by the way, a fascinating story, and it came about in my research. Viewers may be familiar with the book The Longest Winter by Alex Kershaw.
Yep, it came up in the sidebar already, yeah.
And it's the story of Lyle Buck, who commanded the 99th Infantry Division's reconnaissance and intel platoon in the Bulge, famously stopped, was instrumental in delaying the German attack near the Losham Gap. He was held prisoner here in Oflag XIII-B, and was on the tank. Him and the name of the officer who was with him eludes me at the moment, but Buck was riding on one of the Shermans, of those 6 Shermans, and he was down to 120 pounds, 3 months of captivity after the Bulge, and but he was going to fight. And so he was on one of the tanks, and that little group made its way to the main highway 27, which is just north of Carlsbad. It's on the map. And when they got there, because that basically they were sent to do that. Find the way to 27. When you know you're at 27, we'll bring the rest of the task behind you, the task force behind you, and we'll take 27, the more direct route south, thinking that they'll run into the 7th Army, because they knew 3rd Army was gone. They knew they were going in another direction, and the 4th Armored itself was headed elsewhere. But they knew the 7th Army, unknown forces of the 7th, would be to the south, and they just go till they hit them. So when that small group, those half dozen tanks, got to 27, they actually then they jogged to the north, and there they came under fire. The Germans throughout the end of the day prior, from the time that they came across the Hetzers, through the course of the night, the Germans were marshaling forces to totally hem this task force in. And every way out was blocked. And on 27, that was blocked. The Germans they had roadblocks to the north as they turned north, in the next town to the north. They were pinned in, came under heavy fire. A great account of that part of the battle from the book The Longest Winter, and because of Bach being interviewed for it and telling that part of the story. Nutto is captured in that fight, and I think 3 of the tanks come limping back. I think, as I recall, I think they lost 3 there in the town. Baum, as they're actually communicating over the radio, Baum brings the task force up. Then behind them, the folks retreating from there come back. They realize 27 is blocked. We're not getting out that way. So Baum decides to wait until daylight. And he takes the remnants of his force. And by the way, at that point, the prisoners that were still lying, there were a couple hundred that were with them looking to get out, decide to go back to the camp. So he's left, and Lyle Buck being among them, just like a dozen that decide to stay and fight. All the rest, they go back and basically surrender again back at the camp to the Germans, who've now come and taken back control of the camp as the task force has left.
It's just crazy, isn't it? I mean, and again, when you said earlier about if it had been a full combat command, then you would have assumed that back near the river, near the Moselle, there could have been Bailey bridges built. There could have been a task force back there. They could have been in contact and said, "Okay, here's your route out. Here's your relief force." But you know, there are people who don't know this story who are just aghast at how many things about this are just poorly conceived.
Well, what's so interesting is Major Stiller himself later said how he was surprised at the size of the force. And, for example, said, look, what he assumed would happen was that there'd be enough men, enough force to hold the bridges that they crossed. So for their return, you figure, okay, if there's this whole point of view that the Germans are so weak, well, okay, we're going to go through. We'll leave behind it. We know we've got to go across X rivers. Obviously, if there's no bridge, we're not going anywhere. So we go across the bridge. We're going to leave a detachment, leave a company, leave a platoon of tanks, whatever, should be able to hold it. We'll wait for us to come back. No, completely banished to being out on their own. No way, no assurance to coming back. It's mind-numbing, really, when you have to have so much admiration for what these guys did, what Baum did to lead this without question.
This is where the sidebar is separating, in that there, as we predicted, there's the obvious criticism of Patton's idea and the plan, and then there's the respect for the attempt to execute it well by the task force and the commanders themselves. And it's 2 separate things going on there. But it seems a good point to address some of the questions that we had earlier. One is, were the Germans aware of Waters' family connections?
I am not sure that they were. Well, I'd be surprised if they weren't, though. On the other hand, I mean, they've got their identities and everything else. I'd be surprised if they weren't aware. They certainly don't seem to have showed him any preferential treatment, though. Right. If they did, going back to his, from the point that he was captured, for that matter. So I would be conjecture, I guess, and nothing more than that. It's interesting, when Patton visited with him. So it was only a few days afterwards, when Waters was kept. He couldn't be moved from the POW camp. So it was, and Baum, by the way. In fact, I should go back to, before I get to that, I should go back to what happened with the task force finally, because it became catastrophic. So you had Baum that night, again, was going to wait till the morning and daylight to move out. So, hey, they had no sleep. I mean, they've been going from, as it is, they've been in action before the raid without sleep. They've probably gone 3 days without a wink of sleep. And, so he's figuring we got to regroup, rest. We've got to drain gas out of some vehicles. We don't have enough gas to get even the vehicles that we do have. We can't get them back. So let's drain it. They knew they They might have to cross rivers. That he had a plan that, hey, if they got to a river, they would just take a vehicle like a half track and just sink it in the river, and we just try to cross over the over the sunken vehicle. That was about the best they could do. So they spend the night getting what rest they can, treating the wounded. There was a barn structure right near at the base of the mountain, and they put a Red Cross on it. And actually, then we're taking care of wounded in that barn. So they regroup. Sunlight comes up. They're getting ready to move out. And just as they're firing up, they get attacked. And from multiple sides. And they do their best. The tankers are just slamming shells in, trying to see what they can. There's the Germans have infiltrated the woods. It's a wooded hillside on Hill 427, and they're at the base of the mountain or the hill. And so the Germans have come in on the hillside, so within like 50 yards of them in the woods, Panzerfaust. So the Hetzers, there's all open ground and all other. Besides that, they're back. It's all open field in front of them, and now German armor is approaching them. It's a mess. And they try to fight back as best they can. And then Baum just issues the order, sort of every man for himself. Try to go out in groups of 2 or 3, but break up. He goes with Stiller and his radio operator. So him and those two. And they make their way up the mountain. They're in the woods and heading up. And the Germans are just sprawling across the area now, picking up prisoners, getting everybody. Very few. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was only like a half dozen men made it back to American lines. Everybody else was swept up and returned to the Oflag. So Baum, who's already, he was already wounded back in Gmunden, and so he's already taking a licking. They're on the hillside, and then they see some German troops approaching. The radio operator, I think is Seidler, I think was his name, sees them first, and they were in the process at that point of getting ready to burrow under leaves and hide until it was nighttime. And then they were going to figure, we'll move at night. So we're in the process of trying to create their camouflage when the Germans approach. And Seidler actually scampers and takes some cover behind a tree. Baum and Stiller try to still stay hidden, but they're seen. German points a rifle at him. Baum tries to actually fumble for his 45, but he had a bad hand wound. I just remember that from that thing. Bad hand wound. But he's fumbling for his 45, and the German officer, this is Baum's account, just sort of casually puts the rifle down, draws his own pistol, and shoots him. It hits him basically in the nuts, and they have a little bit of an exchange. It turns out the German speaks English, and I can't recall the American city that he said he was from offhand, but he'd spent time in America. Anyway, so now they're all taken prisoner, the 3 of them, and marched back. Seidler is helping to take Baum back, and but they actually get him into a vehicle, I think, and finish the ride. He just was not able to keep going under his own power. So they get him back into the camp, and he gets some, I guess, rudimentary treatment there. Fast forward a bit now, so he's in the camp. By the way, the other men who weren't wounded, if you weren't wounded, and if you were able to be moved, they moved those prisoners. They did not stay there. So the men who had to be moved went like Moosburg, quite a way, hundreds of miles away, maybe. they were marched far from Hammelburg, marched, put on trains, cattle cars at one point to get them out. But they were all taken out of the area. The only men left at the camp were the wounded that couldn't be moved. So they didn't leave them there. So when the 14th Armored Division arrived a few days later, in the course of their normal advance, there was no special mission, nothing of sort. It was just then because the task force was written off. And there's tons of it's fascinating correspondence. And when you see what Patton wrote, what he was writing home to his wife, to his daughter, Waters' husband or wife rather, just the exchange of things in those 2 or 3 days are fascinating to read back, and the color that was being put on it, and some of the revisionism that was already taking place. But once it was confirmed that Waters was there, Patton had two Cub planes flown in to evacuate him, just him, and flew him to a hospital in Frankfurt. And that's where actually that photo was taken. So the whole plane had to be rigged special to be able to get a litter on it, because a Piper Cub is not a big affair. So especially rigged to be able to transport him and fly him over to Frankfurt. And famously too, Waters asked him, "Did you know I was there?" And Patton said, "No, I didn't know you were there." And so Waters, to his credit, was and I'm interpreting a little bit, but he wouldn't have wanted it. He would have, Waters had a tremendous military career, recovered from his wound, retired, I think, as a lieutenant general, if I'm not mistaken. He certainly would not have wanted special treatment. But in any event, Baum was left behind. I think that's to add insult to injury. So he was not transported out. So he got out at his own time, but was taken to the same evacuation hospital. Not at the same time though that Waters was. And Patton visited with him there, and they had an exchange, and Baum was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the raid. And I think it is fair to say he should have gotten the Medal of Honor. If anybody deserved it, he did, for leading that raid. But he didn't. And again, just speculation. But the main reason he probably was not put in for it was because that demands congressional review, and all of the circumstances of the raid, of course, would have been much more exposed.
Yeah, brighter spotlight. Yeah.
Yeah. So if there was, at some point, Baum passed away a few years ago. I had the pleasure of speaking with him when I was doing my research for the first book. So we never talked about the raid, interestingly enough, because it was not in the scope. So we talked about a lot of things about the Bulge time and earlier parts of the campaign. But much to my disappointment, I didn't have the foresight at the time to take advantage of those phone calls to discuss it. But there were the casual at the time, as I recall, the immediate after action report had only 6 members of the task force killed, and I think 19. No, I think the missing all turned out later to be listed as KIA. Of course, a lot of prisoners. Only the 6 men that got back. Managed to make the escape. So just a couple of other postscripts about it. Again, there was a lot of revisionist history by the, things Patton had to say about it, some of the other participants, even Bradley. Bradley, in his memoir, he wrote 2 memoirs. In both of them, he said that he didn't know about the raid beforehand. Patton, on more than one occasion, said that he told him about it, and that Bradley was one of the people who wanted to be a small force. That is, I wanted to be sort of discreet. And so talked him out of that. Patton would say he wanted to do a combat command. He said, but Bradley was one of the people that talked him out of a combat command. But this just goes to show how there's a lot of gray area. We'll never know with absolute certainty, because Bradley's aide later wrote that Bradley knew about the raid beforehand. And so I think after the fact, a lot of the participants wanted to paint it the way that they thought it might be best for them. So I threw out in my book, I hope I've been fair at piecing it together all the best I could, taking into account a lot of some viewpoints and some insights that certainly had not been in some other accounts. And I give it 3 chapters. It deserves a pretty full treatment. So 3 chapters in the book cover the raid, and I hope readers will enjoy it if they pick it up.
Well, definitely. And, you know, the fact that the accounts of the Bradleys and the Pattons and people even ask what Eisenhower's reaction was, the fact they don't tally up and there's differences. It's like, it's the same with anything that doesn't go well. You get the same with Market Garden post, you know, what did James Gavin, General Browning, General Urquhart, Sozabowski, you get it after even going back to Little Bighorn and Benteen and all those people. That always happens. When something goes badly, the senior officers change their stories over time. They kind of, and I'm not criticizing anybody, I'm just saying this is how it ends up. But what I am interested in, because of your research with your books, is you're an average trooper in 4th Armored, and you've come out of World War II with a really good record, apart from this chapter. How is it seen? I mean, obviously there's not many veterans left today, but when you were working on your books, did they kind of roll their eyes when this did come up, when you mentioned it? Is it something they're embarrassed about, or proud of?
No, I think, you know, when it comes to the task force, one thing that I think is very noteworthy is that starting with Baum and everybody who participated in that raid, and certainly all of their peers within the division, knowing it was their own that were sent on this, you would think that there would be a ton of resentment expressed in Patton's direction. But I did not find that to be the case. I think that, hey, we all make mistakes, Patton included. Was this his biggest mistake? I think most people would say yes. This was the biggest error in judgment, self-indulgence that he was ever guilty of. But boy, he did a lot of things really well and great. And the men of the 4th Armored, I think it is certainly my experience talking to them, is that the admiration they had for him in other respects outweighed his foibles and outweighed this thing. You know, I thought I'd read for you. Somebody, maybe they had typed in the chat about Ike, but it was interesting, Ike's reaction. Ike had sent General Marshall a letter about this, and I'll read what he wrote. This I dug up in my research. So this is Ike writing to General Marshall, his superior. Patton's latest crackpot actions may possibly get some publicity. One involved the arbitrary relief of a censor. I took Patton's hide off, but there's nothing else to do about it. Then again, he sent off a little expedition on a wild goose chase in an effort to liberate some American prisoners. The upshot was that he got 25 prisoners back and lost a full company of medium tanks and a platoon of light tanks. Foolishly, he then imposed censorship on the movement, meaning to lift it later, which he forgot to do. The story has been released, and I hope the newspapers do not make too much of it. One bad, though Patton says accidental feature of the affair was that his son-in-law was one of the 25 released. Patton is a problem child, but he is a great fighting leader in pursuit and exploitation. So that's Ike's, to his superior, talking about it. And but boy, that in many respects, that statement at that time, and then recognizing Patton's value and the positives, Sums it all up. What a unique leader, personality, and again, I think in the end, the men of the 4th Armored Division were all extraordinarily proud to serve under him, and help set them up for success in most instances.
No, it is endlessly fascinating, and it's when we did a show about MacArthur's escape from Corregidor 2 or 3 weeks ago. We've talked about Patton before. We've talked about James Gower. We talked about Montgomery, and all of those people have their fans and they have their detractors. And whenever you're analyzing any of these key figures from World War II or other wars, you've got your scales there. Sure, you've got things to put on the bad side, but if you're being objective, you've got to put the things on the good side as well. You can't only look at the bad or only look at the good. And as a Brit, although I don't like Montgomery as a person, I feel the need to kind of defend him when Americans start bringing him down, and I feel the need to kind of somehow defend Patton, even though I feel this is crazy. There's a whole career you have to look at, and just beating him with a stick for this one is unfair when you compare the other things he did. They're human beings who are in command for a long time, and some days go well and some days don't go well, and some decisions they make are better than others, and that's how it is for all of us, I guess.
Yeah.
So, well, there we are. I think we'll bring it to an end there. I mean, we'll definitely have you come back and talk about some of the other fighting in March now, because that's the other thing that by talking about this, we're neglecting what 4th Armored did before then and after then, because this, of course, it's famous to some people. It has this controversy aspect, and it's got the drama. It's got this high excitement and drama as well. But of course, lots of other things happening around the same time, so we can do something back for that in the future, around this time of year next year or the year after or something like that. But are you working on anything else right now since you were on the show last time? Have you picked up pen again? Are you out there busy scrolling away?
Yeah, not writing anything at the moment. I had, as some people viewing may know, I'm the chief executive officer of Firehouse Subs, which is 1,200 unit restaurant chain. And our company was purchased by Restaurant Brands International back in mid-December. So for the last 3 months, I've been extraordinarily busy going through the integration of our companies, but still in leadership of the brand here for years to come, I think. So, but there is another book in here waiting to come out. We'll just get to the right time to work on it.
Well, brilliant, because I mean, as people have been saying, you've got this down. You've presented it from the point of view of the men and the vehicles on the ground, and also addressed the whole Patton factor as well, which is endlessly debatable. And I always think about one of my best friends in the world is Helen Patton, Patton's granddaughter, and every time we meet, she lives with this on a daily basis. Everywhere she goes, there's plenty of stuff to talk about, and that there will never be a time when General Patton is not interesting and there isn't things to say about him, good and bad, by those people. That's the nature of those people at the time, is they were in a position to influence history, which is why we're still talking about it all these decades later. And we can admire them in some ways, and we can look at things they did and say and shake our heads, and it's all valid, I guess. But yeah. Well, anyway, I'll just remind people we're coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, nothing for me tomorrow. And then Monday, we have a show about motor torpedo boats, British. We've got 3 shows coming before I take a break. I say it's a break. I'm actually working, going to do my day job. I'm doing a week-long tour with James Holland of Normandy. So long days, and we're taking groups all through the beaches, the Falaise Gap, the Operation Cobra, all the exciting things there. And then when we get to April, I think it's April the 8th, I'll be back again with a set of shows. They'll be on it. I'll be advertising them on YouTube before I go and do my break. So don't think there's nothing coming up. They're just a bit of a break, and it'll start up again. But again, to remind people, the links to Don's books are in the description below. You can find out about both of these works on the 4th Armored Division. The links to our social media sites, our bookshops, are all in the description below. Don't forget to expand that bit and check out what we have there. And again, thanks for your company this evening. But I'll just bring Don back in to say goodbye and enjoy the Florida sunshine. And I'm going to go and have a beer. So it's been great talking to you. So this is Paul Woodard and Don Fox from World War II TV saying I will see you all again next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.